From Conor McGregor to John Howard, many UFC fighters have been kicked from the UFC. Or should I say, released. The most recent one is Darren Till. You heard me right. Darren Till is reportedly no longer on the UFC's active roster. According to the popular Twitter account, UFC Roster Watch, the Scouse fan favorite was one of several fighters who left the promotion, including Zubaira Tukhugov and Jose Johnson. The shocking news comes on the heels of Till's 3-fight losing streak in the octagon. Dricus du Plessis recently defeated Till in the third round of UFC 282 in December 2022. Derek Brunson had previously defeated him via rear naked choke and Robert Whittaker via unanimous decision. He did win a split decision over Kelvin Gastelum, despite suffering a brutal KO from Jorge Masvidal on home soil and a loss to Tyron Woodley for the welterweight title. Till has gone 1-5 in his last 6 UFC fights since his loss to former champ Woodley, the first defeat of his career. He's been finished in 4 of those losses. He now has an 18-win, 5-loss, and 1-draw professional record. Despite receiving a $50,000 Fight of the Night bonus for his performance against du Plessis, it appears that Till has made a decision for himself. When UFC Roster Watch announced the news on Twitter, fans expressed sadness for the talented striker. "Damn," said YouTuber turned boxer KSI. "Unexpected, but not a surprise," said another. After Till's loss to du Plessis, UFC President Dana White spoke about the former title challenger's future. "That is the fight of the night. I don't believe his stock will fall at all," White stated at a press conference. But he isn't the first fighter to be released by the UFC. Conor McGregor, for once, was also one of them. The former UFC featherweight and the lightweight champion was briefly released from the promotion in 2019 following an incident at a UFC media event. In April 2018, McGregor and a group of his associates attacked a bus carrying several UFC fighters, including Khabib Nurmagomedov, who was scheduled to fight McGregor at UFC 223. McGregor threw a dolly through the bus window, injuring several fighters and causing chaos at the event. As a result of the incident, McGregor was charged with several crimes, including assault and criminal mischief. He later pled guilty to a reduced charge of disorderly conduct. He was sentenced to community service and anger management classes. In the aftermath of the incident, the UFC decided to take disciplinary action against McGregor and announced that it had stripped him of his lightweight title. McGregor was also briefly released from his UFC contract, although he was quickly re-signed by the promotion and went on to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov in one of the biggest fights in UFC history in October 2018. Since then, McGregor has remained one of the biggest stars in the UFC and has continued to compete at the highest level. But he has faced other legal issues outside of the octagon. But the next fighter, despite being famous, was still let go by the UFC. It's Tito Ortiz. The former UFC light heavyweight champion and one of the most recognizable fighters in the promotion's history was let go by the UFC in 2012 after a series of disputes with UFC management. Ortiz had a long history of disagreements with UFC President Dana White, dating back to the early days of the promotion. In 2012, he publicly criticized the UFC for its treatment of fighters and its lack of a pension plan, among other issues. In addition, Ortiz had become less competitive in the octagon in his later years and was coming off a 3-fight losing streak. The UFC decided not to renew his contract, and Ortiz subsequently signed with the rival Bellator MMA promotion. Well, that didn't work out. But guess what else didn't? John Howard and his contract with the UFC. The promotion released the former UFC welterweight fighter in 2015 after a 3-fight losing streak. Howard had a successful start to his UFC career, winning 4 of his first 5 fights in the promotion. But he then suffered a split decision loss to Jake Ellenberger in 2010, which began a period of inconsistency for the fighter. After the loss to Ellenberger, Howard alternated wins and losses in his next 6 fights in the UFC. He then suffered a 3-fight losing streak, dropping decisions to Ryan LaFleur, Brian Ebersol, and Lorenz Larkin. Following the loss to Larkin in January 2015, the UFC released Howard from his contract. Howard went on to compete in other organizations, such as the World Series of Fighting and the Legacy Fighting Alliance. before returning to the UFC in 2018. But he was released in 2020 after losing 2 of his 3 fights in his latest promotion. And on that note, let's move on to the fighter who pulled a one-direction move and went on a hiatus. It's Georges St-Pierre, widely regarded as one of the greatest mixed martial artists of all time. He was not exactly kicked out of the UFC, but took a break from the promotion in 2013 after a controversial split decision victory over Johnny Hendricks at UFC 167. After the fight, St-Pierre announced that he was taking a break from the sport to deal with personal issues, including mental and physical exhaustion. He vacated his welterweight title, and the UFC announced that Hendricks would fight Robbie Lawler for the vacant title. In addition to his personal issues, St-Pierre had also been vocal about his dissatisfaction with the UFC's drug testing policies and its handling of fighter compensation. He had previously criticized the UFC for not doing enough to prevent the use of performance-enhancing drugs in the sport, and he had also expressed concern about the long-term health risks of fighting. St-Pierre remained away from the UFC for several years, but he eventually returned to the promotion in 2017 and won the middleweight title in his comeback fight against Michael Bisping. He then vacated the title and announced another hiatus from the sport, citing concerns about his health and the difficulty of making weight at the middleweight limit. But this next fighter didn't take a hiatus. The UFC just let him go. It's Elias Theodorou. The former UFC middleweight fighter was released by the promotion in 2019 despite having a winning record in the UFC. Theodorou successfully started his UFC career, winning 6 of his first 8 fights in the promotion. However, he was criticized by some fans and analysts for his relatively cautious fighting style, which prioritized volume striking and takedowns over finishing opponents. In his last fight in the UFC, Theodorou lost a split decision to Derek Brunson at UFC Ottawa in May 2019. While the fight was close, many observers believed that Brunson had done enough to win, and the promotion subsequently released Theodorou. Despite his release from the UFC, Theodorou has continued to compete in MMA, signing with other organizations such as the Professional Fighters League, PFL, and the Canadian-based TKO organization. He's also been outspoken about his use of medical cannabis for pain management. He's advocated for its legalization in sports. But they say you lose some matches and you're out. This is what happened with Tom Duquesnoy. The former UFC bantamweight fighter was released from the promotion in 2018 after a string of inconsistent performances. Duquesnoy had a highly anticipated debut in the UFC in 2017. He won his first fight in the UFC against Patrick Williams by TKO in the second round, but struggled in his next 2 fights, losing to Cody Stamann by a split decision and Nathaniel Wood by TKO. After the loss to Wood in March 2018, Duquesnoy announced that he was taking a hiatus from MMA competition to focus on his personal life and to reassess his future in the sport, and was then removed from the UFC roster. In interviews following his departure from the UFC, Duquesnoy expressed a desire to take time off from competition to work on his technique, and also to improve his mental and physical health. Well, that's all for the stars who got kicked out of the UFC.